On August the 28th, 1917, shortly after the commissioning of Yamashiro, with Ise nearing completion, Hyuga well underway, and World War I in its third year, Japan began its next class of battleship. This was the first of the two 33,800-ton Nagato class. For fiscal reasons, it wasn't until almost a year later that her sister was started. More on that in a bit. The main reasoning for these two was the upgunning taking place in Japan's most likely enemy, the United States. America had already held hearings on and authorized the 16-inch gunned Colorado class, even though due to wartime priorities being on merchants and destroyers, they wouldn't be completed until later. Japan's answer was the 16.1-inch 45 caliber gun. Okay, folks, this is where it's going to get ugly. In the late teens, Japan started switching over to the metric system. As a result, in most cases, their equipment was measured in metric. For those of us used to the inch, the only advice I can offer is that 1 inch equals about 25.33 millimeters. So, since they were designing their equipment using metric, in reality this wasn't a 16.1 inch gun, it was a 410 millimeter or 41 centimeter gun. Still lacking the technical capacity to design large guns themselves, these guns were basically an enlarged version of the 14-inch gun of previous battleships. The larger and thus heavier shell meant their guns could penetrate thicker armor and had more capacity. This meant the two midship turrets of the previous classes could be discarded, which improved structural strength while still keeping about the same weight of fire. This meant the forecastle deck could again run all the way to turret 3, improving dryness. As good as these two were individually, in fact, aside from Hood, they were the fastest battleships in the world at the time of their introduction, there was only 2 of them. This, even as most other powers were embarking on massive construction programs, the U.S. in particular. Following the 4 Colorados, the U.S. planned the 6 Lexington-class battlecruisers with 8 16-inch guns and 33 knots, if not armor. More serious was the 6 heavily armored South Dakotas with 12 16-inch 50 caliber guns. Japan's version was the 888 program, a series of 8 battleships and 8 battle cruisers, the later really being more of fast battleships than true battle cruisers, to be built in 8 years. The Nagatos were to be the first pair of battleships. They were to be followed by the 2 Kagas, which would have been essentially enlarged Nagatos with a 5th twin 410mm turret. These would be followed by the 4 47,500-ton ships of the unnamed No. 13 class, which would carry 4 twin 460mm guns. On the battlecruiser side would be the 4 ships of the Amagi class, followed by the 4 ships of the Ki class, all carrying 10 410mm guns in 5 twin turrets and displacing around 40,000 tons. Like other countries, there was only one stumbling block to this ambitious plan: economics. Most countries were too far in debt as a result of World War I to see their construction plans through. The U.S., on the other hand, had the money, but not the political will to spend it. As you might have guessed from the year-long delays in funding Yamashiro and Mutsu, for Japan, the problem was one of scale. Compared to other major naval powers, Japan's industrial and economic ability was much smaller, making it totally out of scope with its ambitions. Even with the Navy consuming about 40% of the nation's GDP, it could only fund about 1.5 capital ships per year. Even at that staggering rate, Mutsu was only paid for by supplementing her funding with donations from school children, making her something of a national treasure. Knowing then that they were straining to fund 4 battlecruisers and 6 battleships in 8 years, I'll let you decide on the feasibility of paying for 6 more battleships and 8 more battlecruisers, all larger than their predecessors, in the same amount of time. Fortunately for Japan, in the early 20s along came the Washington Conference. At a stroke, Japan could cancel these economically crippling construction plans without dishonorably appearing weak. Yes, many in the military were unhappy about being limited to two-thirds the size of the U.S., but as with many who complained about spending cutbacks, they didn't have the dubious honor of writing the checks. The only caveat was that originally the treaty called for the canceling of Mutsu. With the thought of her being a national treasure due to her funding in the back of their mind, the Japanese delegation argued that she had already been completed and as such wasn't under construction. With the threat of the conference breaking down and the other powers relenting, Japan was allowed to keep her in exchange for the U.S. being allowed to finish 2 more of the Colorados and the British being allowed to build 2 new 16-inch gun ships later. These were eventually realized as the 2 ships of the Nelson class.
私が戦艦ナガトだ。よろしく頼むぞ。敵戦艦との殴り合いなら任せておけ。
Nagato was started August 28, 1917 and completed November 25, 1920.
ナガト型戦艦2番艦のムツよ。よろしくね。あまり火遊びはしないでね。お願いよ。
Mutsu was started June 1st, 1918 and completed October 24th, 1921. Main armament was 8 410mm 45 caliber guns in 4 twin individually sleeved turrets, 2 forward and 2 aft. Each mount weighed 1,004 tons and had a maximum elevation of 30 degrees, which came out to a range of about 16 miles. Realistic rate of fire was about 2 rounds per minute per gun. Originally, the loading angle was up to 20 degrees, but this was mechanically tricky, so realistically it was at 3 degrees. Recoil was about 6 feet. Propellant was in 4 483-pound bags. 90 rounds were carried per gun. Muzzle velocity was about 2,600 feet per second. By World War II, they carried 3 main types of rounds. The first was a 2,249-pound armor-piercing round with a 32.8-pound bursting charge. The second was a 2,069-pound high-explosive or contact round with a 97.9-pound bursting charge. The third was the 2,072-pound Sanshikidan incendiary shrapnel anti-aircraft shotgun round. Secondary armament was 20 of the 5.5-inch 50 caliber guns, still in casemates, all midship. 14 were built into the forecastle deck, with 1 pair aside turret 2, the second pair aside the conning tower, the third pair aside the rear legs of the forward tower, the fourth pair aside the forward funnel, the fifth pair aside and between the 2 funnels, the sixth pair was further back aside the forward legs of the rear tripod, and the 7th pair was aside the rear legs of the rear tripod. The remaining 6 guns were essentially built into the superstructure, with the casemates above and between the 2nd and 3rd pair, the 3rd and 4th pair, and the 4th and 5th pair. Turretary armament was 4 3-inch 40 caliber anti-aircraft guns in single open mounts midship, 2 on either side. 8 21-inch torpedo tubes rounded out the main armament, with 4 underwater and 4 above. The submerged tubes were in 4 single mounts, 2 on each side, with 1 tube being beyond each end of the armored citadel. The above-water tubes were on the upper deck aside the rear funnel. Propulsion was provided by 21 boilers venting to 2 funnels. 15 of them were oil-fired, while the other 6 burned coal. These provided steam to 4 turbines, which generated 80,000 horsepower. Each turbine directly drove one of the 4 propellers for a top speed of 26 knots. There was 1 rudder. Protection was still of the incremental type. The main belt, which straddled the waterline, was 12 inches, thinning to 8 inches at the top, and stretching from turret 1 to turret 4, with 13-inch bulkheads forming the ends of the armored citadel. In front of turret 1, it reduced to 8 inches, and then 4 inches near the bow. Behind turret 4, it reduced to 8 inches besides the steering gear, and then to 4 inches near the stern. Below the belt, it slimmed to 6 inches. Below that, 3 inches, bowed inward, and then downward all the way to the top of the double bottom. Total deck armor was a combined 6 inches spread across 3 decks, with the main deck being 1 inch, the second deck being an inch, and the third deck being 3.9 inches. The 3.9 inch armored deck sat just above the waterline and ran perpendicular to the belt. At the sides, it slimmed to 3 inches and sloped downward to meet where the 6-inch bottom of the belt reduced to 3 inches and began bowing inwards. Barbette armor was up to 12 inches. Turret armor was 11 3/4 inches on the front, 8 3/4 inches on the sides, and up to 5 3/4 inches on the roofs. An armored bulkhead ran down the middle of each turret to separate each gun. Casemate armor was only 1 inch. Conning tower armor was up to 14.5 inches on the sides. The engineering spaces were divided into 3 rooms of 5 oil boilers sited longwise side by side. Behind them was 2 widthwise rooms which each housed 3 coal-burning boilers. Behind them was the engine room housing the 2 turbines that ran the outer shafts. Behind it was the engine room with the 2 turbines that ran the inner shafts. They were double-bottomed. Modifications were many, as was the case with most battleships that survived the Washington Treaty. In 1922, the distinctive thumbnail smoke deflector was fitted. During a late 1924 through 1925 overhaul, their forward funnel was cranked back almost to the rear funnel in a further effort to keep smoke out of the tower, which gained more and more platforms to support ever longer range gunfire. In late 1925, an experimental flying-off platform was fitted to Nagato's No. 2 turret. In early 1932, the 4 3-inch anti-aircraft guns were replaced by 8 of the then-new 5-inch 40-caliber anti-aircraft guns in 4 twin mounts, 2 on either side midship. Only a few months later, in mid-1932, a crane and catapult were fitted behind the rear tower for spotter float planes. From April 1, 1939 to January 31, 1936, Nagato began her rebuild, with Mutsu getting the same from September 5, 1934 to September 30, 1936. All 4 main turrets were replaced with improved ones from ships that were canceled by the Washington Treaty. These turrets were roomier and had an increased elevation of 43 degrees, which raised maximum range to 24 miles. They also had more armor. Turret armor increased to 460 millimeters on the front, 280 millimeters on the sides, and up to 250 millimeters on the roof. Barbette armor was also increased to 460 millimeters. Deck armor was increased to a combined 190 millimeters. The forwardmost pair of 5.5-inch guns were removed as being too wet, and the casemates were plated over. The 18 remaining secondaries had their maximum elevation increased to 35 degrees. To improve hydrodynamics, the stern was lengthened 25 feet, and they received a clipper bow. To give them a credible TDS and restore lost buoyancy, bulges were added that ran from turret 1 to turret 4. This was at the perfectly acceptable expense of removing all of the torpedo tubes. The forward mast was reconstructed into the pagoda structure by removing the forward funnel. This, in turn, as with other ships, was only possible by re-engining. All of their old boilers were removed and replaced with 4 large, each in its own compartment, and 6 smaller, still 3 in 2 compartment, oil-burning ones. These provided steam to 4 new, more powerful turbines that produced 82,000 horsepower. With more power and better hydrodynamics against the increased displacement of 39,120 tons, meant speed only dropped marginally to about 25 knots. Except for more light and medium anti-aircraft, very little major work was done to them up till and during the war. The most notable thing was the adding of crushing tubing to the TDS in 1941. In May of 1943, Nagato received radar, while apparently Mutsu never got it. Following the Battle of the Philippine Sea, in late June, early July 1944, Nagato landed another pair of secondaries for more light and medium anti-aircraft. In 1945, another pair of twin 5-inch 40 caliber heavy anti-aircraft mounts were fitted. All of the portholes were welded shut, and all but the two rear pair of secondaries were removed. Of course, by then, with virtually no fuel or air cover, she was little more than a stationary floating anti-aircraft hulk. Nagato and Mutsu were at port in Japan on December 7, 1941. With the exception of the Battle of Midway, they mostly stayed there for the first year and a half of the war, awaiting the expected Great Decisive Battle. At noon on June 8, 1943, while in port, Mutsu's No. 3 magazine exploded, blowing the ship in half.
戦いで沈む。なんでだろう。あまり悔しくはないわ。
The forward three quarters capsized to starboard until the pagoda buried itself in the mud. The rear quarter upended and sank vertically the next day. At a stroke, the ship Japan had allowed the U.S. and British to have Colorado, West Virginia, Nelson, and Rodney for was gone, having never fired on the enemy. Even worse, going down with her were 100 carrier pilot cadets and their 40 instructors who had been visiting her. This, even as Japan was trying desperately to replace the hundreds of carrier pilots it had lost the previous year. Nagato remained in Japan another few months until mid-August 1943, when, along with other ships, she loaded troops and supplies, then sailed for Truk, arriving later that month. Only sailing in mid-October 1943 in a failed attempt to intercept the U.S. carrier raids on Wake, she mostly stayed at Truk. At the start of February 1944, she left Truk and transferred to the East Indies, along with most of the other heavy surface ships, where they could be closer to their oil supplies and mostly away from American carriers and subs. Arriving near the end of the month, she mostly guarded the pier. In mid-June 1944, Nagato and most of the rest of the surface fleet sailed east and took part in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, where she suffered no serious damage, then returned to Japan near the end of the month for repairs and refit. Arriving back at the East Indies in mid-July 1944, she stayed there until mid-October 1944, when she sailed for the Battle of Leyte Gulf. At the Battle of the Sibuyan Sea, she suffered several near misses and 2 bomb hits. One caused only minor damage, knocking out a pair of casemated guns and one of the 5-inch anti-aircraft mounts. The other knocked out the air intake to one of the boiler rooms, temporarily reducing her speed as smoke filled the room. The next day, at the Battle of Samar, she was hit by 2 more bombs that caused minor damage to her bow. Having lost the battle, she returned to the East Indies at the end of the month. Half a month later, in mid-November, still with most of the heavy surface ships, she left the East Indies and returned to Japan, arriving near the end of the month for repairs and upgrades. By mid-February 1945, without fuel or air support, she was effectively reduced to a floating anti-aircraft platform, being damaged several times by numerous air attacks during the remaining of the war. Post-war, Nagato was the only Japanese battleship still above water and was taken over by the U.S. The American technical groups sent to study her sophistication post-war were unimpressed. Even worse, like most other Japanese ships, she was a run-down, dilapidated mess, nearly in wreckage state. In March of 1946, a skeleton American crew tried to sail her to the Marshall Islands along with the cruiser Sakawa. This didn't go well, and between only two outboard propellers really working, her hull leaking, which caused her to take on water. With 3 of 8 boilers initially working, she finally had to be towed to Inuitak. The end came for Nagato at Bikini, where she survived the airdropped Test Able, but the underwater Test Baker mortally wounded her.
戦いの中で沈むのだ。あの光ではなく、本望だな。
On July 29, 1946, she rolled over and sunk, coming to rest upside down, her pagoda breaking off as she hit bottom.